Thank you all for coming. This is Debabrata Ghoshal, short for Deb, Deb for short. This is Washington Quantum Computing Meetup, DC. Today we are going to hear investment landscapes of quantum information science by Andre, and our moderator is Denise. So Denise is our Chief Business Officer of CQC. Our sponsors are CQC and Association Quantum. Do you move the next one? Okay, Association Quantum is our partner, and it's a non-profit organization which is dedicated to spreading quantum knowledge. They have a lot of exciting webinars coming up, so check out their website for more details. They are also supporting other meetup groups with webinars. So if you need any help, feel free to contact them. And they have their own webinar in quantum in financial services. And on Wednesday, June 24, 2020 at 11:45 a.m. So please join that webinar. The website is there, Association Quantum, and speaker is Vishal Shetty. And you can go to the website and check the details and join them. Okay. The next one is ours, the announcement for July 22, and Dr. Tamer Elquad will be talking about quantum parallelism in quantum algorithm. That will be an exciting one also. So July 22, 7 p.m. You can RSVP in our website, as you always do. The next webinar would be a panel discussion. The topic is not decided yet. It will be soon. This week sometime. Check our website. And Dr. Chauvier and Dr. Kao will be there from Zapata Quantum Computing. They will be doing it on August 4th. The timing is a little different, although on the website it says at 7 o'clock, it is actually 6 o'clock. Please note that the 6 o'clock to 8 o'clock, that panel discussion will be on August 4th. And the last one is on August 20 by Shara Kaiser. It is about implementation of QRAM in Q#. That's a very exciting one also. We are looking forward to having, a topic on QRAM on August 20th, okay? This would be on August 20th. So that is, those are the announcements you can see in the websites. The websites are given in the chat, I believe. All the websites you can copy. Now, Denise Ruffner is the Chief Business Officer for CQC, and she is the moderator of this evening. She is actually our sponsors for CQC, and she was in IBM when I first talked to her regarding a speaker in 2 years back, and then she joined CQC, and she knows Andre because they have their own podcast, weekly podcast. You can Google it and find it out more about it, or Denise can talk about it also. So Denise, here is your screen, and you can go ahead and introduce Andre and have a great talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deb. It's really nice to be here. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. It looks like we have 64 people online. Awesome. I wanted to ask you, I noticed a number of you have sent little chats to the panelists saying hello. Thank you for doing that. If I could get you to switch over to the Q&A button. If you have any questions during the talk, I'll be collecting questions to ask Andre. And so the format for tonight is I'm going to introduce Andre. He's brought some slides to talk through. And then I wanted to have a discussion with him about the quantum kind of investment landscape and startup ecosystem and kind of a whole host of topics. So I actually have a list of questions prepared for him that he hasn't seen, as well as I'm looking forward to your questions. So hopefully we can have a real lively discussion tonight. I think I always value the time I spend with Andre and his insights into the quantum community. So I think we're all going to learn a lot from him tonight. So now let me give you an introduction. Andre is a published author. He's a global speaker and recognized expert on deep tech. He has over 25 years of consulting and startup experience. He is now CEO of Interference Advisors, and he's leading the world's largest premier data provider and advisory firm in quantum technology. And he also is an investor in this space through his fund called Entanglement Capital. And Andre aced the MIT quantum computing courses. He also holds an MBA in economics from the University of Chicago Booth School of Business, as well as a master's in business from the ICN School of Management. He speaks English, German, and French. And he also competes in national small boat sailing championships. And I'm very jealous. He's always tan. He lives basically on the beach in Miami. So unfortunately, he's not near his windows where you can see a gorgeous sunset. But I think you can all see he's been spending way too much time on the beach and he looks really tan. So welcome, Andre, and we look forward to hearing your presentation.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Denise. I'll show the sunset for my closing arguments. We probably will need an hour for the sun to set here over Biscayne Bay. Thank you so much to Deb and Association Quantum for having us. And it's always great to work with you, Denise. Check out our video cast, the weekly Quantum World Detangled. It's on YouTube and really a lot of fun. Today we're here to talk about the investment landscape in quantum tech, and that's something that I've been dedicated to for the last 3.5, 4 years. On the one side, collecting a lot of data on the space, both startups as well as investors and deals made, and that is data that is difficult to come by, obviously, since it's not in the yellow pages, as well as trying to understand where the opportunities lie. So I will share a little bit of my approach in a few slides. We'll look at some of the data that I have, not all of it, but some of it, and I'll walk you through how I go about making decisions and what I see in the space. I do have very strong opinions on this, and I hope that will be valuable, and I welcome challenges and debate and a conversation, and I'll stop throughout my talk to hopefully encourage that. But with that, I'll present you my point of view on how it could and should be. Let me share my screen, and hopefully you all see my slides. I'll go into present mode. And we'll start with this very famous quote by Edward Deming, who once said, without data, you're just another person with an opinion. And that is really something that also throughout my consulting career, my academic career at the University of Chicago as an economist, has always been forced into my brain. Opinions are great and nice, but that is not a way to make business decisions. And I've always been exposed to frameworks and tools to bring data and structure to decision making. So that is kind of my mission in quantum tech as well. So we'll talk about kind of 5 different topics very quickly here that lead to having a data-driven approach to investing into quantum tech, and then also what that means for the startups in the ecosystem. Firstly, understanding quantum tech, which sounds obvious and silly, but is challenging, probably for everybody amongst us, and we're so-called experts, but certainly for the layman. How to segment quantum tech deals, how to benchmark them, how to score your quantum tech pipeline, and ultimately how to make an investment decision and successfully operate your target company. So looking at understanding quantum tech, something that I've always been fascinated with is cognitive bias. And here on the right, you see the cognitive bias codex, which is a very famous wheel, and you see the human brain in the middle that categorizes different biases that have been established by behavioral researchers. I had the privilege of studying under Richard Thaler, a Nobel Prize winner in economics for behavioral research. One thing he found is that the smarter and the more educated the person, the more likely they actually are to fall prey to these cognitive biases. Just because we know so much and we have so much information in our heads and we're so good at processing it, we are really very likely to kind of fall back to these reflexes and brain muscle memories that we've acquired over our careers, academically and professionally, to make decisions and judgments. And that's very, very bad. In the context of an investor, looking at the quantum tech landscape and trying to reach an investment decision, that investor most likely is going to be faced with a very smart PhD in quantum physics, a doctor in philosophy, very, very spooky technology, and so forth, right? All things that we know very well. And if I can understand a qubit and how a quantum computer works, then I probably can also understand how an investment decision works. How difficult can it be to do a little bit of sales and marketing, get a customer, and ultimately be successful as a company, right? That is really a reflex that I put 99% here. I don't have empirical data on this, but this is really a reflex that I see a lot in quantum tech, both on the startup side, so entrepreneurs and CEOs of our fellow quantum tech ventures, as well as investors that are very smart, very well educated, that are looking to source and do diligence on these deals. And that really leads to a few different problems. I've listed 3 here. Number 1, failure to understand how a specific quantum computing modality, for example, defines your TAM-SAM. TAM-SAM is a very typical sales and marketing term that you learn in business school. This is basically the overall size of your market and the size of the addressable market in that overall available market that you as a company can pursue, and a very common metric that an investor is going to look to assess. I am currently, to give you an example, hoping to close out the lead investment in a 60 million euro round in a quantum full stack company. I spoke about it with another investor that was very interested in it. This company, a European company using the superconducting modality, great pitch deck, great credentials. The investor got very excited, stopped responding to me for a couple days. I call him up and say, hey, are you still interested in this? And he responds, no, I just invested into a photonic quantum computing company, and I feel like my quantum computing investment play is covered. And that, pardon my French, is just bullshit, right? Because a quantum computing photonic approach has a completely different business model, addressable market, serviceable market, audience, timeline, and so forth than a superconducting company. So in consequence, it will attract a very different type of capital from a very different type of source with very different terms, very different valuations, and very different expectations. The failure by that investor to understand that difference of how a modality ultimately not just drives timeline to quantum supremacy, but also the addressable market and the revenue model was really key here. Point B, I just touched on revenue model, NISQ era machines versus universal quantum computers is a great kind of little mind play here. If you take our friends at IBM, for example, they make revenue today, right? And they make a very specific revenue that is mostly driven through cloud subscribers and the IBM Q cloud, as well as consulting, and that is great. But it is financially very different from a provider that is looking to sell hardware on-premise a few years from now. Again, investors failing to understand some of these basics. And really, failing to understand, many different paths leading to Rome, meaning everybody is excited about quantum supremacy, disrupting Wall Street, disrupting chemistry, disrupting materials, but they fail to understand how to get there. So this is just a fundamental kind of first topic, understanding quantum tech, and many investors simply fail to put in the time and the resources required to do that. They have invested into digital technologies before, which are fairly easy to understand. They've invested into artificial intelligence before, which is more complicated to understand, but still something you can approach with Wikipedia and conferences and YouTube and books. Now they're trying to do quantum, and that is just a lot more difficult for some of the reasons that I mentioned here. All these slides, by the way, will be available online. You see a little read more here link in the bottom left corner. I actually wrote an article just about this specific topic, so you can look at that. And this really is just to set the baseline of my talk. Many investors still make gut-driven, opinion-driven decisions. My goal here really is to change this, help them get a deep understanding and a deep appreciation for the nuances in quantum tech to make better decisions. We'll be looking at a lot of my data and how I go about that in the next three topics. One uses of this data that I collect and analyze, and here on the right, you see some of the things we do, just taking the baseline data, which is in a database, sortable, searchable, and highly tagged with metadata, extracting insights from it and running it through an expert network that I have. We, for example, produce market-driven analyst reports around quantum tech topics, quantum tech companies, to help investors make sense of this landscape and hopefully get started on a good foot. So that's just to get us started. I'll take a little breather here and to see if there are any initial questions before we look at how to segment quantum tech deals. Denise, any questions from you or the audience so far?
Why don't you just keep on going? I'm going to collect questions.
Awesome, let's do it. So the second topic here, segmenting the quantum tech, and this should read ecosystem or landscape in the title rather than deals. The argument I'm making here that a typical investor, after she tries to make sense of a given space, in this case quantum, will then need to source deals. After she sources deals, she needs to assess these deals and do due diligence, ultimately make a decision on the investment, and finally make that investment and operate the company. What I'm saying here is that you shouldn't pursue a typical deal sourcing strategy. Again, you have an article that I specifically wrote about this topic, linked here at the bottom in the left corner. The way an investor will typically source a deal is through a number of ways. Their network, and investors are great professional networkers, not just at cocktail parties and conferences and a dozen daily Zoom calls. They also professionally maintain a Rolodex in a CRM like Salesforce, and are very diligent at following up with that. They will rely on inbound deals just by creating a name for themselves, and I'm sure pretty much everybody here on the call can name a famous venture capitalist or other investor that they know. And they kind of rely on social media as well, especially Twitter, but also LinkedIn, where they will reach out to people and get inbound leads as well. That is an approach that can work. It is an approach that can work especially in large established markets. I mentioned artificial intelligence, where by now you have thousands and thousands of companies that are well understood and categorized and accessible. You have a lot of data. It is not something that, in my opinion, the argument I'm making here works in quantum tech. Why? Again, the first point, quantum tech is, exponentially more complex and difficult to understand than other technologies. Number two, it is still immature. Just think back 2 or 3, 4 years. There weren't very many companies around. There weren't many conferences around. Still today, it is very difficult to get reliable data on just who are all the quantum computing hardware startups. Doug gave a great talk last week or 2 weeks ago, whenever the last meetup was, a very nice approach with his quantum tech stack that he has. Still, this is not exhaustive. It's not insightful data, and it's very difficult to make a decision based on that. So the argument that I'm making here is that instead of relying on classical deal sourcing, you as an investor should proactively look at segmenting the quantum tech kind of landscape. There are many different types of investors, right? You have private investors, many times called angels, that will invest in anything that they find interesting or exciting. Some of them have a little bit more discipline and focus, but that's generally their play. You have venture capitalists, and venture capitalists will have a focus on a country, on an industry, on a vertical, on a specific use case, on a specific technology. They will also have a specific investment thesis. If they are passive or active investors, what timeline they expect a certain return, in how much of a return they expect, and so forth. You have family offices that have a completely different behavior. You have corporate and strategic investors that will probably not be a lead investor, much less activist, less concerned about the financial performance, which still will be important, and more concerned in transfer of knowledge, technology, and building a customer base. So depending on that, I think there is a real opportunity to kind of segment the overall quantum tech landscape. And if you look across the top, I have quantum software, hardware, quantum communications, quantum sensing, and KQD. And if you just apply a measure along the other axis of kind of, I called it universal quantum tech, but anything that goes beyond the current NISQ era and is 5 to 15 years out, that is one bucket. Below that, you have the NISQ era, especially of course in quantum hardware, but also in software. You still have a lot of companies out there that are focused on basic science, be it again on the hardware side or on the software side, where they say we still need to spend our time and resources on finding algorithms, proving them out, and writing the best software for it. And you also, many times a little forgotten, have a whole supply chain ecosystem, especially on the hardware side, of course. These boxes all will fit overwhelmingly very specific investment thesis. It would make no sense for an angel investor to look at quantum hardware, very simply put, right? It also wouldn't make much sense for a large venture capitalist to look at the basic science software company, because that might just be too small and too far out, right? So if you put a little bit of structure around it, and hopefully you can read the different colors here, you very quickly can segment this market, and this now allows you as an investor, based on your investment thesis, timeline, risk profile, to very proactively identify a niche in the market that now you can own. So rather than trying to understand everything and have a network of everybody, you now can deal with a much more manageable slice of the pie and go after that. I don't know if this sounds obvious or not obvious to most of you. What I can tell you, speaking to investors every day, that I know maybe 3 out there that do this. Everybody else still has this old habit, reflex. Let me talk to my network. Let me call this professor, this university. Let me call IBM or Google or Microsoft. Let me ask Denise what would be a good company. They do not have structure to it. This also is not a Bible. This is what I'd call a North Star. It's a framework. The purpose of a framework is to provide you with a basis for decision making that you then continuously iterate on. You iterate on whenever you obtain new, better data, and you iterate on whenever you learn something disruptive about your framework. But now you have a basis for doing this rather than just passively sitting there and responding to incoming pitch decks. Before I pause, vice versa, for a quantum tech startup entrepreneur, this is a big opportunity to position yourself. If you understand where you fit in here and how this relates to investors, you really have an opportunity to set yourself apart from the competition by offering up information about your company, by helping to offer up information about your little corner of this quantum tech world, so they can understand your little box a little bit better, and really through good, positive, open communication, help investors not only find you, but better understand you and better understand your space that you're in. Doing that will make a huge difference when time to raise money comes for you. So I think we really can skip this for the most part, why data matters. I hope I brought this point home now. It is really to avoid these cognitive biases. And it is the MAG is a business framework: define, measure, analyze, improve, control. This idea that opinions, judgment, gut decisions, passive deal flow in this context don't matter, but a proactive methodology that you define, that you're able to measure, only then you're able to analyze and improve on it and ultimately have a controllable result, is the best way to go about it. This also, very important, does not mean you remove your personality or your personal judgment from this process. this is still a critical part of the process. It just now sits on a foundation of data and frameworks. One quick word to how we go about collecting this data, which in quantum tech is very difficult, of course, because you can't just Google it. So we take a very proactive and disciplined approach to collecting that data from web parsing and extraction algorithms on a number of entities and concepts. We have a large collection of news sources that we monitor, a large personal network, and then obviously conferences and so forth. We systematically collect all that data, put it into a central database, timestamp it, tag it, annotate it, note it, categorize it, whatever else you can imagine. And then spit it out in a sortable, searchable interface, and we'll talk about that in a second. But before we get there, I'll pause again and see if Denise or anybody in the audience has questions.
We have a contest on who can unmute me. Andre, what type of data exactly do you collect? Can you detail a little bit more about the data that you collect?
Absolutely, and we'll be looking at it actually live in roughly 5 minutes. But I have data sets on the quantum vendors, the quantum startups, the quantum use cases, the quantum investors, quantum professors, quantum institutes, quantum government programs. Really anything that you can think of. We probably have some sort of data set, and they are by no means all perfect or perfectly up to date and error free. I'm in a NISC era of data collection myself, but really data sets on anything that an executive or an investor would find helpful in making a decision. So we also look at qubit counts and other things, but I think there are great sources out there to do that. What we are more interested in is in understanding who the players are, what the use cases are, who the investors are, the capital, and see how that evolves over time. Because by observing here this graphic on the right side, by observing this data and taking note of gaps, of extremes, changes over time, that is where you find interesting insights.
So I've always been really impressed by the data you collect, and I'm always amazed by the depth of data. I think you're coming up to a demo on the data.
Yep, I have one more slide, I think, and then we'll take a look at it.
Cool.
That was a gentle nudge. Thank you, Denise.
I want to see the data, of course.
All right, I have one more thing to say and 2 slides, and then we'll look at the data, I promise.
Okay.
Third step that I'm proposing in this approach to investing into quantum tech, and again, if you are an entrepreneur in quantum, always think about the flip side of this. And I write a lot about both sides of that coin in my newsletters. You see another link here in the bottom left corner. So if you're curious about the other side, feel free to reach out or check the newsletter. But the purpose of this data is then to do interesting stuff with it that will be helpful, right? And the 2 most interesting things that you can do with in the context of investing into quantum tech are benchmarking and scoring. So benchmarking is the idea of how, from a business point of view, from a financial point of view, do you compare 5 different superconducting quantum hardware companies? How do you compare a dozen different quantum software companies? Because they all are really great at telling you about their research, the amazing world-class team they have. Just listen to the Quantum Tech conference going on right now, which is amazing. And if you're not listening to it, check out some of the recordings. But I think almost everybody introduced themselves over the last 2 days by saying, we are the leading quantum ... company. That's simply not possible, right? Not everybody can be leading, but that's how people present themselves. So how do you make sense of that? This is really through benchmarking, and benchmarking is the idea of looking at the same set of data-driven questions for every company in a specific category, scoring it, which we'll look at next after we look at the data, and thus creating a baseline on which, as a starting point, stretching the fact here that this is not what in itself makes the decision, but ultimately offering you this baseline for decision making. And in my beautiful handwriting, this is from one of my newsletters on the right side here, a little matrix of internal rate of return of our target company over time, and just a very simple plot of how companies could be segmented, and then in each segment benchmarked accordingly. Very important in then working with data once you've committed to understanding it and collecting it, as we discussed in the first 2 points. When you start working with it, be it benchmarking, be it scoring it, or doing other things, is how do you visualize the data? And visualization is extremely important. Making data interactive, making it intuitive, offering the ability to personalize it, and offering the ability to collaborate around it is the real value of data. It's not the data itself. And 2 tables here on the right side that I just grabbed from a Google search on employee type of salary and task data. You see the difference just in visualizing the data, right? The top table, aesthetic, black and white, you can't touch it, you can't play with it, you can't dig into the table. Underneath, a highly dynamic, nicely presented, collaborative table. A huge difference in how you will engage with it, how you will start to think about data, and what you'll be able to do with it. With that, before Denise gets angry at me, let's look at some data. And we will start out with some company data. Let me move this. Okay. Hold on. My Zoom bar is, there we go. All right. So I keep my data in a data visualization tool called Tableau, which you see here. In Tableau, I create what's called workbooks, companies in QIS, investments in QIS, tech specs, use cases, and so forth. And within each workbook, I'm going to have different projects that visualize different data sets. My data itself is kept in so far just spreadsheets. I'll give you a quick look here. So I have thousands and thousands of lines of data that is annotated with dozens and dozens of columns of tags that then allow you to visualize the data. If we look at QIS companies by country, for example, while this comes up here, you will see that I can very easily, just from this data, for example, generate a world map that shows companies across the globe by region. And I can then decide to visualize different metrics. Here I show, I think these are quantum sensing companies. I have to check the filters. but when you go over it in these different regions, you know, get a very visual impression, and you know, you could change colors to indicate the strengths of your indicator, for example, but making it very visual to show for a specific segment, for a specific benchmark that you're trying to understand how this is distributed and how this has evolved over time. You see a little play button here on the left. If you have the timestamps for your data, you can now also, you know, hit play, and this will show you over the last 3 years, for example, how this data has evolved. I have another chart and another interface here, a total number of quantum firms, just a different presentation, and this is 4 weeks old. I haven't updated it yet, but we'll do so by next week. There's a total of 329 quantum tech companies in here. You see them categorized by different applications, algorithms, consulting, hardware, software, sensing, and so forth. And you see the breakdown by category, as well as how this evolves over time. So this is the data set that I can then, pardon me, import here into Tableau to try to get a better understanding of certain aspects of this data. To look at the same data set, let me go back into my workbook here. I have QIC companies by application. You know, this bar chart that I just showed you is very nice, and it highlights different categories. But here, for example, I can very easily just present in many different visualizations how these applications evolve. So here, just this kind of cube pie chart, not sure what exactly the name of it is, but if I go into edit mode, I'm going to show you a little bit of behind the scenes. So when I work with an investor or an investment deal, you know, here are all my meta tags that I have on the left side. So you see this is a long list. So this is everything that we collect for any of these startups, anyone in here. We have all of this data. And then Tableau has a very complex, and I'm still learning the ins and outs of how to visualize it, where you simply take a piece of data, you drag it on here, select the type of visualization that you want, and you're done. So if you prefer a bar chart, you can get a bar chart. If you just want to show it as a table, you can get it as a table, as a pie chart, and so forth. And this is all shareable, embeddable, and can easily be collaborated around. So this is just a quick look at some of the company data. What is interesting here, I think, is the sheer number of companies, which I think is a lot bigger than the data that you're used to see around the ecosystem. Also this morning, there was an investor panel at Quantum Tech Digital, and one investor mentioned that he is aware of a total of 300 companies. So I have some competition there, which is great. That is good for everybody. But also very interesting is the breakdown. We talked about suppliers earlier. This obviously is very attractive for risk-averse investors that want to participate in the growth of quantum, but are less concerned about an outsized return and more concerned with preserving their cash, but still having exposure. What's also interesting is if you look at the distribution between software and hardware companies, I here have a count of 82 software companies and 74 hardware companies. I think those numbers in themselves are very interesting due to their size and importance. They are also interesting, I find, because it's a lot of hardware that's being built out there. there are a lot more quantum computers and quantum hardware out there than one might think. And there is actually more software than hardware, which is very unusual in a nascent industry. If you look at other industries, hardware-driven industries in the past, usually a hardware vendor would also build some sort of software, and that was kind of it. Other software ventures would follow later on when more traction and more use cases would have been established. So this is a real sign and vote of confidence for the industry. So this is the kind of data that I use to, if you go back to understanding the quantum tech system, this is the kind of data that I use and that my clients work with in terms of starting to segment and understand the quantum space. And just to go back in edit mode here once again, you really can compare anything for anything. So I have all my meta tags. If you look at this left menu here that I'm scrolling through, I think I have 50 to 60 meta tags. I can compare anything for everything, right? If I want a timeline, I can produce a timeline. If I want investments by category, by country, and we'll look at some of that. Really, you can start to drill down, understand what's happening, and understand how it's evolving over time, which is super important.
Hey, Andre.
Denise, you got some data.
I have a question from the audience. Do you track employee counts with industries? And how do you find that data? Maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
That's a very good question. I have a very disappointing answer to it. I intend to track employee count, but I haven't done so yet, which is simply a limitation of my own resources. I do believe there is a way to track employee count. Although I'm actually limiting myself, and I should have made that a little clearer up here when I talked about my methodology, to data that is publicly or otherwise verifiable, which is hard with employee count. But you can get a good sense of employee count by tracking job postings. And I have a job post feed, and I know that a couple other folks in the industry are working on aggregate job feeds. You can also get a sense of employee count by looking at the investment amount and how that evolves over time. Because obviously, folks need to be paid, and it's you kind of can make a good educated guess how much quantum PhD will be paid, a software developer, and so forth. So still a little difficult to track. I haven't done a good job at it, but it's on my radar.
Andre, is this data publicly available?
No, you are getting a very exclusive look at the behind the scenes here. This data is available to my customers as a paying subscription service online at interference.consulting. I do write a weekly newsletter, which sometimes only comes out every 10 or 14 days, but it is weekly in theory, where I kind of opine based on the data that I see. I also have a paid newsletter, which is $15, I believe, a month, where I offer a summary of the data. So not the data itself, just a summary of the new data. So there are a couple different ways that you can check it out. It's not publicly available unless you're a paying customer. If anyone has a specific question that's quick to answer, feel free to reach out. My contact details will be on the last slide, and I'll do my best to answer.
And I want to give a plug for your newsletters. I think they're great and they're insightful. I might compare them. I think I've seen some other studies by other analysts on quantum computing, and I don't think what I feel that they don't show the insight that you typically show in the industry knowledge. And I'll point out, I think in your recent podcast, or in our recent podcast, we discussed a study by IDC. And I think it clearly demonstrated that some of the questions seemed to me that they really didn't understand the market. And I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about your specialization in the market compared to others.
And thank you for the compliment. Yeah, I'm not a physicist or quantum scientist. I remember attending one of my very first conferences on quantum in Chicago 4 years ago, and in the lunch line, I end up standing behind the organizer, Professor Dr. Arshalam, and he asked me how I enjoyed the morning. I said, you know, how fantastic it was, but I only understood about 5% of the content, and he laughs, claps me on the back and says, well, that's great, so you understand half as much as I do. So that made me feel a little bit better, but I put roughly 3 years of, you know, studying quantum, taking my certificates at MIT, but reading research, talking to a lot of people to understand the technology the best I can. And I bring 25 years of, you know, consulting, Fortune 500 and startup experience. So everything I do is through that lens. How do I help an investor? How do I help an executive be successful in quantum tech? And how do we as an ecosystem avoid hype? Because I think, having worked in artificial intelligence, having worked in digital transformation, having done a little bit of blockchain before, hype and misinformation is one of the most destructive and hurtful elements in a nascent ecosystem that there can be. And I always, here in my newsletter, this gentleman, by the way, Farai, in Africa, helps me with my data, so thank you to him. He was up late to help me prepare a little bit. So I really try to only stick to things that are verifiable and public, or that are verifiable or public, and then take a business-driven lens at it. And that is something that is lacking out there a lot, where you have former high-performance computing analysts, part-time people, and other clowns, opining freely about quantum, and that is very, very hurtful, very, very bad for the industry. You also have some media outlets out there that write, frankly, bullshit articles about quantum, and that just creates bad expectations. And I certainly make mistakes, and I'm far from perfect, but like a few others in this industry, we had Duck last week, or last time, obviously, and some others, Terrell out of Harrisburg, and other people that really put a lot of effort and focus onto this. This is kind of my mission, having a dedicated, objective voice for the business community in all of this.
Okay, Andre, thank you. Art, do you have other slides?
I have one slide and then the fun data, because we haven't seen the best data yet.
Okay.
So let me go back into presenting mode. So the next step, we looked at understanding quantum tech. We looked at segmenting the quantum tech landscape to source deals. We looked at benchmarking quantum tech deals. Then, in an investment funnel, you now found a company that you're really excited about, and you're trying to do your due diligence. And that obviously is extremely difficult, right? How do you assess the quality of a qubit and the performance? There are still dogfights out there amongst the big vendors to come to agreement on that topic, right? So if you're an investor, even if you by now understand quantum fairly well at this point, this is an extremely challenging question. There also are methodologies that investors historically rely on, such as looking at comparables, meaning how do other companies compare and what metrics are underlying to make due diligence of a company. There are projection-based due diligence companies where over, let's say, 5 years, you would map out certain revenue goals and then understand what it takes in terms of sales, of marketing, operations, and so forth, costs and people and resources to get there. All of this is very difficult to do in quantum tech because it is such a complex topic, but also because we don't have the track record, and this data just doesn't exist. So something that I do here is, again, create the data. As you've understood by now, I'm a big believer in being data-driven. If the data doesn't exist yet, that is fantastic. That is an opportunity. Go create that data. That might take a lot of work and you know, be not the most fun part of your work day, but it is very rewarding. So to do this due diligence, I have frameworks to assess, number one, the tech maturity of a company, number two, the business maturity of a quantum tech startup, and number three, the investment maturity of a startup. These three maturity scores, imagine them as a set of questions, 20 to 40 questions that are targeted by QIS application and field, as well as by deal stage, and that are scored from 0 to 10. And just as you benchmarked quantum companies against each other, now you're basically digging a few levels deeper across the technology, but also across the business skills and acumen of the company and the investment criteria that an investor will be most interested in to score the quality of a company. If you followed my approach so far and you operate in one of these small boxes on the graphic we looked at earlier here, and you're able to score, let's say, 5 or 6 or 7 companies within one of these boxes, you have a really much better data-driven picture of the performance of this company. If you want to learn more about that, there's a link again to an article that I wrote about it. But before Denise scolds me, let's look at some of that data. Sorry, I need to move my... All right, here we go. We'll go back to Tableau. And we're going to go into my investment workbook. Hold on, where are you? Give me a second here. Well, let's we'll just start it from here. So similar to what you saw by companies, you can now start to look at specific investment metrics, right? An investor, for example, might want to know if a certain country or region presents better opportunities than another one. And here I'm looking at number of investment deals. I think that's over the last 12 months. I would need to check the filter. But again, you have a very visual map. You have all the information at your fingertips. You have a bunch of filters that you can set up here. This gives an investor that is looking for opportunities a tool to assess this very quickly. If you're interested in government funding versus private funding, which we just looked at, you can pull this up, right? And then you can see how different countries and governments have committed to quantum technologies. And I'll give a little plug to my home country, Germany, that is actually leading in the world. And so far, the government has committed $3 billion at the national level to quantum technologies. You can start to look at startups by country, but really anything else, right? And here actually have the different shades of color that I mentioned, so you can easily see, obviously, the US leading here with investment deals done, so the home of the startups that have been invested in. So you can very, very easily see sort of a heat map of where investments have been targeted. We can do the same by, let's see how I have data in here, by application. I do not have data in here. We'll come back to that later. Oh, you can, investors will always be very interested in who is the lead investor and who is the follow-on investor. Lead investor is the investor that will take a seat on the board of directors, that will negotiate and dictate the teams, and then usually you have a handful or more of other follow-on investors that basically say, we trust you, lead investor, to lead this round. We just bring our capital, but you're in charge of managing everything. And then forgive me, ABCs here, this should be yes or no, but you have the yes and no here, so you can see who in a specific deal or not has been a lead investor versus a follow-on investor. A lot of interesting information. Let me see what else we have. There was something else I did want to show people. We go into my investment in QIS. Obviously you can see investments by QIS application. There you go. Again, a nice little visualization, and that just gives you a very quick picture and impression of where there might be opportunities or not. So you get the gist of how this works. These scoring spreadsheets that I build, and some of the data that I just showed you is the result of some of these scores. So I will take the average score over hundreds of questions that I scored 0 to 10, or somebody that might help me, or an investor. And then we can visualize this specific aspect of a quantum tech company. We also do that, and I do want to stretch that, business maturity. We try to assess the sales capability of a quantum tech company. We try to assess the marketing capabilities, the operational capabilities, which are just critical in a venture, be it quantum tech or not. So really look at a lot of aspects that go beyond what's typically discussed on investor panels or startup panels in the industry, where it mostly seems to be about your qubits, your variational eigensolvers, or whatever else, which is super important, but in my equation, only 1/3 of the input. Investment maturity, we're going to look at, capital needs, exit potential. What is the exit strategy of our startup? Meaning, how can the investor monetize her investment? Timeline, valuations, and so forth. So again, 20 to 40 questions for any of these data points that spit out a score, and then can be easily visualized on a map, on a timeline, on a heat map, on a chart in my data visualization service to reach your ultimate decision. We looked at the data, and I have my closing slide, unless there are any questions.
So one of the questions is, there's an echo. Do you track organizations that educate or train the market on quantum knowledge? Is that part of your segments, or how do you tell us a little more about that?
Thank you for asking that. Yes, I do. Let me actually start here. This is a chart of research institutes by country. So I track that. And I'm especially interested in countries outside the usual suspects. You see Rwanda, Nigeria, Kenya, you see Thailand, Malta. So really trying to be as exhaustive as possible. I track government institutes by country. I track individual professors and university labs. But to go back to my initial bar chart that I showed you earlier, I track media companies, and I currently count 11. I also track consulting companies, and I count currently 29 companies that are engaged in consulting services in quantum computing. I have started to see a few quantum education initiatives pop up recently, which is something that I have not added yet, but absolutely should and will do. But so yes, I try to track the entire ecosystem, including professional services and any supporting kind of activities.
Okay, great, thank you. Do you want to go to your closing slide, or?
Let's do it. All right. So if you followed my approach and you became a data-driven investor, or again think about the flip side, an entrepreneur that will cater to such an investor, you really will start to see a few distinct opportunities, especially in the context of the current health pandemic and economic crisis that we're certainly in right now. Who knows how long that will last? But that has, if you look at the data, precipitated what many call quantum winter, if not a technical quantum winter, at least a business and company quantum winter. And that really leads to a couple distinct opportunities for investors. And if anybody wants to know more about what I currently see in the investor market, I'm happy to address that in the Q&A section. But there are a lot of follow-on down rounds of larger quantum players being currently closed out or considered. What that means is that there are companies out there that raised 20, 50, 100 million or potentially even more dollars over the last few years, have been very successful, but over the last 6 months failed to deliver on expectations to their investors. They've missed revenue targets, they've missed partnership targets, MVP targets, potential revenue coming from quantum simulation, quantum consulting, and so forth. Certain investors will see this as an opportunity by investing into what's called a down round. So they will commit to invest additional capital in this company, but at a valuation that is inferior to the previous valuation, and that's called a down round. So this is a very bad deal for the startup, for the venture, and it's a very bad sign to the market, but it keeps the company alive. It really gives you, a second chance at quantum life, and it puts investors into a really strong position because they now have a better rate of return calculation and probably terms that come with it that are very beneficial to the investor. A second opportunity that I've seen a lot in the investment community lately is that ecosystems are and will be forming. I think we all know the large players, IBM, Google, Microsoft, and so forth, There was a great presentation at the Quantum Tech by Amazon this morning. Honeywell, that is very prominent in the news and really very present for the last few weeks on the scene. I would expect some or many of these large vendors to increasingly build an ecosystem around them, potentially taking stakes or even outright acquiring companies that bring certain capabilities or resources or teams to these large vendors that will be faster and easier to buy rather than to build. And that is a big opportunity for investors who are able to spot these trends. Thirdly, there is a large number of very interesting seed activity. So these smaller quantum tech companies, many times software or algorithmic companies, that are less reliant on commercial activity and really just need to finance a team of 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 folks for a period of 2-3 years to solve a very specific issue. And there are a lot of teams recently that have been able to secure funding to do just that. I should have added a fourth point here. We all have seen in the news some very large deals being made. Our friends in Finland, IQM, raising over 30 million in the last few days, and that is a round that will grow significantly over the next couple of months. Anybody interested in that, please reach out to me. We have seen a few photonic hardware companies raising very, very large rounds. So there are also some strategic bets being made. But these investors that are able to read the quantum tea leaves have some tremendous opportunities in this current marketplace. If you want to learn more about it, reach out to me or read the blog post in the left corner. I encourage you to be more like Tom Cruise in Minority Report. Look at the data, get your hands dirty with the data, interact with it, make data-driven decisions. This presentation for the curious is available on my website. The link is in the bottom right corner. Just scroll down all the way above the contact box, and there's a link to this deck for anyone that wants to look at it. And that is what I have.
Well, thank you, Andre. I'm really excited. There's a lot of great questions to ask you. So, well, everybody, I want to just thank you. That was a great talk. The discipline around your data, I think, is really amazing. I also look back and I remember in January of 2018 when I was at IBM and we were trying to come up with startups to form an ecosystem, and there were 10. And so now there's 329. Tell me, is this rate of startup development typical? Is it larger than in other innovative industries? Is it smaller? What do you read in that there's so many startups?
I think it's a function of several different factors. Number one, you've been able to observe a bunch of quantum tech startups coming out of stealth mode, so separating from the university or labs and actually forming a legal entity, getting a grant and raising some money. I always, also the more I dig into some of these of the beaten path countries, discover new companies and they are not very well documented. So I think there's a big element of just discovering new data that previously nobody has discovered, not necessarily new companies. I do, to the first part of my answer, see a lot of surprisingly ambitious teams forming companies. We had Alice and Bob out of France just a couple weeks ago, to name an example, with really great credentials and a great team, and they are coming out of nowhere and entering the scene. I just think a lot of folks feel like the time is right to be in quantum. I think everybody here on this call has a different opinion on when we will reach quantum supremacy, or maybe we already did, I don't know, and when there will be really practical applications. But I think everybody feels like now is the time to make your play for it. It is going to take a couple years to build a team and be successful. I think people are eager to get started and not fall behind.
Great. So, okay, so we have a lot of questions from the audience. I'm going to do them in no particular order. But one of the questions is why a venture firm might invest in different quantum technologies. So you talked about photonic versus other technologies. And I think it's always interesting. I'd like to hear your opinion on why someone chooses what technology for a quantum computer.
I think there are two types of investors. There is the investor that maybe says, 500,000 or a couple million isn't really that much for me, and I think this is exciting technology. We had famously Mr. Lazardis of BlackBerry fame, who put in, I believe, 325 million of his own money, so a little bit more than a couple million. Because he believed in quantum tech, and he thought that his corner of the world and Canada can be a leader in it. So these are people just making bets because they are excited about the technology, and that's great if you can afford to do that. Then I think every investor is always looking for a return. And an investor doesn't set her own terms, right? An investor, if it's not your own money, actually raised a fund themselves from many other people, private wealthy individuals, investment funds, insurance companies, whatever else it might be. And they all agree on an investment thesis, which says, your fund will live for 10 years. Within 10 years, you need to give us a report every 3 months. Every year you need to meet these and these metrics, and so on and so on. So investors are very concerned about finding startups in quantum tech that fit this established structure of how investment deals are being done. And that is very difficult with us not knowing if quantum, practical, supremacy, whatever it is 18 months away, as Tony from Honeywell has said before, or 10 years, as others say. So they just kind of grab whatever they think makes sense within that investment thesis, is my observation, to be honest.
Okay. Another question from LQ. Which industries or sectors are currently more interested in investing in quantum computing solutions?
Talking about corporate investors, I'd assume in that question. Again, if you watch quantum tech the last couple of days, you might have listened to companies like BMW or Bosch, and coincidentally to German companies again. These are all companies that are invested into quantum technologies, and they all will say, from the get-go, the reason they are invested is because it affects their own customer base due to the nature of the business. In the case of Bosch and BMW, it might be a traveling salesman problem, how they optimize traffic. It might be a material problem and how they optimize battery performance for electric cars. It might be a new material problem, and coming up with new materials, maybe do 3D printing of cars, something crazy, right? So it is all these sectors that you would expect being impacted by quantum, traveling salesman problem, chemistry, medicine, and financial services, obviously. I think there are a lot of people, or some people out there, I'm one of them, who believe that Wall Street might be disrupted by quantum computing. Lending might be disrupted by quantum computing. Risk management. How long that will take, not sure, but a lot of those big Wall Street banks, Main Street banks, or insurance companies are certainly looking at it. So these are also the sectors making strategic investments into quantum hardware and software companies.
So Andrea, I wanted to come back to investors in quantum computing. I think most people typically think of investors as venture capitalists, and you have a good grasp of the different types of investors in quantum computing. And I know you've mentioned family offices, which is typically a very wealthy individual who has a firm around investing. You've mentioned a venture capital firm. Could you talk a little bit more about getting money out of corporates, corporate venture arms, and how they might invest in a company and how that's a little different than a typical investor?
All these investor types that you just mentioned have a very different investment thesis, which is what we discussed a couple times. The length of the life of the fund, the return they expect, the criteria they have to meet, also what they're able to do with their money and not. So all of them behave very differently. If you look at an angel or a family office, a personal relationship is certainly very helpful, because these are literally individuals making decisions for themselves. If you look at typical venture capital, you will need to have your pitch deck with all the typical elements in it. You'll need to have your projections. You'll need to have your due diligence documents ready to do that. A corporate investor, again, looking at a BMW or a Bosch or somebody else, they will be looking for something different, right? They not necessarily are interested so much in a return on their capital. They certainly would love that, and they certainly don't want to lose money, but they think about it strategically, because they want to acquire a certain technology, because they want to acquire certain teams, because they want to acquire a certain cachet or branding in the market, and that is important to them. So you really have to understand, when talking to a large Fortune 500 type of company, why might they be interested in quantum tech? And that is what you have to play for. I spoke to the board of directors of a Fortune 500 company last week, and they just said, we don't, and sorry, IBM and everybody else, but we just don't want to be dependent from IBM. So they made strategic investments into 3 quantum hardware companies just to have access to that technology. So understanding what that strategic interest for a specific player is most important.
Another question from Ravens: which area of quantum information science is likely to grow the most in the short-term future?
And Raymond is probably asking about revenue, I'd assume. That's difficult to say, right? You clearly have companies in quantum key distribution, quantum encryption that have in the past made significant revenue. Somebody like ID Quantique, I know that you, Denise, and Cambridge Quantum Computing are very active in that and successful with Iron Bridge. And that's a field that's been around for much longer, that is potentially less finicky than a qubit, that still likes it dark and cold and silent. It's also a field that has a bigger sense of urgency, because if you look at the next 5 to 10 years, well, there are many companies that have a legal liability and legal requirements to keep their data. So if a quantum encryption or regular encryption is at risk over that time frame, if you're a bank, if you're an insurance company, if you have otherwise sensitive data, you really need to get started with quantum safe encryption today. So that is a field that definitely has revenue and that is growing. It's not humongous either. I think you're starting to see more and more national projects wanting to build quantum internets, for example. So quantum communication, and out of China, again, some amazing, impressive news over the last couple of days, what they did with a satellite-based system, but there's certainly public and private money flowing into building real quantum communication infrastructure today, and then probably scaling it in the future. Quantum computing itself, hardware and software, is still very consulting, very simulation, very project driven. But I think we might see some surprises in the market in the next few months to couple years, and that revenue will then pick up tremendously. The overall, if you remember TAM from my third or fourth slide, the overall addressable market for quantum computing is certainly the most significant one.
Okay. This is a bit of a diversion, but I think interesting. Since you track individual professors, what do you think about the mention today at Quantum Tech that John Preskill is now affiliated with Amazon, given his past association with Microsoft? And do you, Andre, have any opinions about Amazon's quantum plays? Andre always has an opinion, so that's a great question. Jamie Gill, thank you.
Oh God, I always have opinions, and I try not to say them on publicly recorded webcasts. I don't know John personally. Obviously, him leaving Microsoft, which has a very bold vision, but hasn't evidenced a lot of traction for a new player like Amazon, is a move that signals very certain signals. It signals. Amazon is very smart, and Amazon showed a slide of the Amazon flywheel, which is this very famous Amazon business concept of how to build an entire new industry where customer satisfaction on one side and technological innovation encircled by this flywheel of iteration and building a self-reinforcing ecosystem is very interesting. And they presented a vision where they not just show a quantum computing stack, but a quantum computing stack that's fully integrated in the cloud into a classical stack, which is kind of unique. And John seems to think that that is worth his time more than pursuing topological visions at Microsoft. Good for him. Good for Amazon.
Yeah, I think so. I live in Pasadena, where John Preskill, I think, is. So it's always exciting to hear locals in the news, but John certainly is quite an influencer in our industry. And so it's interesting to hear that he's at Amazon with a lot of other great talent. Andre, I wanted to, let me just see. I think one of the questions that we always get, and I'm sure you've heard this before, is how much is it a challenge to find and hire relevantly trained students? And I'm hoping that when you answer, you'll do a call out for Terrell. So you knew I was going to go there. So could you tell us about finding talent and the difficulties or easiness of doing that?
And I did mention Terrell already, I believe, but absolutely Terrell at the University of Harrisburg is in the middle of Quantum Palooza, his project to bring quantum to high school students, which is tremendous. And him and I, we had a little chat about it just a few days ago. He wasn't even sure how to teach them and what to teach them, just taking it day by day and hour by hour. And he said he was surprised by how well it was going and how interested the students were and how well they actually understood everything. So that is tremendous, and hopefully an emerging blueprint for many other high school students. A plug for my alma mater, the University of Chicago, which just rolled out an executive education program in quantum. All of this obviously takes time, right? A high school student isn't going to be enormously helpful for at least a couple years in a quantum venture, be it on the research or business side. But a helping hand is always appreciated, and a student that has been exposed to the theory and application of quantum will be very helpful. It is very difficult to find people, at least in the big markets, the US, Canada, Europe, and so forth, simply because everybody is already working on something and they just have to weigh their options. I was speaking to a buddy of mine, Nick, yesterday, who just got accepted into the Creative Destruction Lab in Canada, and he said, but can I still focus on my research now? And can I keep my wife happy while doing this? So people are weighing a lot of these professional and personal options. Finding talent is a huge challenge. I will make another plug for my buddy Farai from South Africa, Zimbabwe. He studied quantum computing at the University of I'm not even going to try to pronounce it, but he has a master's degree in quantum, and he is an IBM quantum ambassador or advocate. So those are resources that have the same skills and expertise as anyone here. They might not have the same experience because they haven't had the privilege of working at Cambridge or with me or anyone else here on this call, right? But there are a lot of people in Latin America and Africa and Asia. We spoke to Thailand, you and I, Denise, and our friends there a few days ago. So in a world of remote work, I think you'll be able to find what you need if you look a little bit outside the box.
Thanks, Andre. And I have two more questions. I know you've been talking for a long time, so I'll talk for a minute. Everyone, Andre and I do a weekly podcast. It's called Weekly Quantum World Detangled. And it's a really interesting podcast. We try to make it interesting. We have a paper of the week every week. We also generally have a guest every week. A couple weeks ago, we had Tony Utley from Honeywell talk about their new quantum computer. Last week, we had a Thai group present. We're recording another one tomorrow with a surprise guest. But I really encourage you guys to watch the podcast because I'm kind of laughing. One of the second to the last questions is, what is your thought on the growth of quantum machine learning, which is something we discussed in the last podcast. So hence the plug for the podcast. But Andre, maybe you could talk a little bit about your thought on the growth or your thoughts on the growth of quantum machine learning at this point in our development of quantum computing software.
Yeah, now you're asking me the more technical questions. It is a few things to say about it. It is something that investors are very intrigued by, number one, and that's just because a lot of investors that now invest into quantum previously invested into artificial intelligence and machine learning. So they feel a certain sense of familiarity there, but also see a lot of opportunity. There seems, and I'm not the best person to judge that, but there seems to be an uptick in research around machine learning, but also other artificial intelligence, such as natural language processing. I don't know, Denise, if you know somebody in that field, and other related quantum AI topics emerging. I do think, and that's the third point, talking to customers, some of these Fortune 500 type of companies that I talk to, they are getting more and more concerned with the big picture of quantum. Rather than looking at individual use cases, how can I use a quantum computer for a specific molecule or new material or my battery optimization? Is there something more profound that we can do with quantum technology? And that starts to look at, how to work with your enterprise data, and how to leverage neural networks and other artificial intelligence applications. It is something that also seems, a year or two farther out than maybe other quantum computing applications in terms of what we need to get there, but an exciting field for sure.
Thanks, Andre. And I'll put in a plug. CQC has recently published some quantum NLP work, and there are a couple meetups coming up where Konstantinos from CQC will talk about it. So take a look at the meetup website if you want to learn more about QNLP. Now, the final question, and it's a good one, from Lalit, is derived from your data trove. What are the three major takeaways about the state of the quantum kind of union?
Yeah, I talked a little bit about that on my final slide, but taking a little bit of a different perspective on it. The ecosystem is definitely growing very, very strongly, and it is growing very strongly outside the usual markets: US, Canada, Europe, China, Russia, Japan, as well. And that is a great sign, but also not a great sign. It's a great sign because it shows, the acceptance and the widespread nature of quantum. It also, in my mind, validates the need and the thirst and hunger for quantum. It is also a bad thing because it's the third time I'm using the word bullshit in this video presentation, because you see a lot of bullshit companies out there. I mentioned one in a newsletter of mine a couple of weeks ago that did a blockchain tokenization of quantum software. I don't know what that means, but it's bullshit, and that's just profiteering of quantum technology. So it's a great opportunity, but I think we all need to watch out for overhyping the industry. Secondly, I believe a lot of people always talk about a technical quantum winter. I'm actually not sure that we're seeing that, but there definitely is a little bit of a business quantum winter, and a lot of companies and even established companies struggling or getting these down rounds that we talked about, new capital at lower valuations, which just sucks. You don't want that if you're the CEO of a company. So I think there will be a big shakeout of the industry over the next 6 to 12 months. Lastly, and we all have seen that at Quantum Tech and other venues over the last couple of weeks, I think there is more diversity and folks are getting more vocal. It used to be our friends at IBM and a bunch of startups. Then Google declared supremacy or whatever it was. Now you have Honeywell on the scene, and Honeywell is very aggressive. You have Amazon on the scene, and if Amazon gets behind that, anybody that's in the cloud needs to be concerned. So I think that's amazing, and that again just speaks to the real world demand for quantum. Even so, we still don't have a proper use case. So things in my mind could evolve very, very quickly in the near future.
Great, great. Thank you, Andre. Any parting wisdom or any encouragement you can give the crowd? I want to shout out that we really have an international crowd. We have people from Australia, from Turkey, from South America. I think you've attracted an amazing group of people. The majority have lasted an hour and 45 minutes, which shows the interest in what you have to say. I think as a conclusion, I want all of you to really understand what a great resource there is in Andre and how much data he really does have and insights, and that you can't, oh, and Singapore is on too, sorry. But I want you to understand really the amount of insight and data that Andre has and what a good resource he is for all of you in the quantum world to help you answer questions or strategize or make decisions. I'm always, I think I probably spent too much time on the phone with Andre asking his opinion, but he's just a great resource for all of us. So Andre, I don't know if you have anything you want to add in closing before we thank everyone.
Yeah, just thank you to Alan and Deb and Association Quantum. There's a question by Kathy if we hire college interns. You know, that might come soon. I'm currently not next week, but eventually. Just stay in touch. If you see people like Denise here, and you know Denise and Cambridge Quantum Computing, that's the creme de la creme in quantum startups. Go bother her on LinkedIn. Go bother me on LinkedIn. You have my website, andrekönig.com. Stay in touch. There's a great startup community, onequantum.org, where startups can join to learn and exchange and collaborate. This is a great time to be in quantum. Quantum is a fascinating technology that holds tremendous amounts of promise. Nobody knows when and how it will deliver on that. It's a privilege to work in quantum, build relationships. There are a lot of fascinating and really helpful folks in the community, Denise being the number one in terms of offering support, not just to me, but many, many people around the world. It's today. Don't wait. Get into it. Reach out to any one of us, and we look forward to seeing you.
It's a
Quantum is coming.
Yeah, it's a great group of people. Quantum is coming, and look to Andre and I and all of your colleagues for support, because we're all here helping each other, I think, build something very exciting. So thank you all for joining. Thank you, Andre, for a great talk. Again,
and we missed the sunset. Now it's just dark out in Miami, but you see the water.
Beautiful. Thank you for that, Andre. And thank you, everyone. I wish you a great evening, or for those of you in Singapore, morning. But thank you very much for joining us. And we look forward to hearing from you on LinkedIn or through Andre's email. Thank you. Good night. Good morning.
Thank you, Andre and Denise. Can you show me the announcements again, Amulak? Yes. So please come to the, you know, all these announcements we have for the Association Quantum. On the next one will be on the June 24th, Wednesday at 11:45 by, you know, Quantum in Financial Services by Vishal Shetty, Head of Quantum and Senior, and then Quantum Parallelism in Quantum Algorithms by Dr. Tamer El-Koholi. Look forward for July 22nd. And the next one is, you know, a panel discussion topic, you know, to be determined. It will be on August 4th, 6 to 8 p.m. And this is from Christopher Savoy and Dr. Yurang Kao from the Zapata Computing. It will be an exciting one also. And the last one would be on August 20th by Dr. Shara Kaiser, implementing QRAM in Q#, a case study in community-driven quantum development. So we look forward for all. Please join us. Go to the websites and RSVP, and we'll see you for the next one. And Denise and Andre for the exciting and great discussion we had. I'm sure we'll invite you again sometime back. Okay, in future or sometime after. Okay, thank you.
Looking forward to it. Thank you.